Welcome back, Aaron Shelenberger, to Restitutio. So glad to have another opportunity to chat with you today about your fascinating research on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. And
Glad to be here, Sean. Thank you for having me again.
yeah, so glad you were available, and I really appreciate your time. Last time we sort of ended talking about Scripture, and that was our main topic, was Ehrman's case against the Gospels being reliable, and you made a nice argument, a very compelling case for the general reliability. And the listener needs to be aware, or viewer, that your strategy here, and it's a tried and true, tested in many debates strategy, is not to build a case for everything. You're just trying to do the minimum in order to make a case for the resurrection. And I think people might get a little confused about what it is, where it is you're coming from. You're not trying to attack Scripture. You're trying to establish it just enough so that we can get to talking about the evidence for the resurrection from Scripture itself. And so I don't know, did you want to clarify anything on that?
I didn't want our viewers to get the impression that I have a low view of Scripture. As a matter of fact, I have a high view of Scripture. I just don't consider myself an inerrantist. I just happen to think that there are some minor errors, what I regard as errors in good faith, which are completely inconsequential to the historical veracity of the Bible, and especially to the resurrection of Jesus and other essential teachings of the Bible pertaining to salvation and Christian living. So, I would classify myself as a high reliabilist because I find the Bible to be highly reliable. And hence, not to mention the Gospels are highly reliable. They're not just generally reliable, they're highly reliable, so.
But in our last conversation, your angle was simply to establish general reliability.
Right.
Not because that's all you believe, but because that's the minimum required in order to use the evidence there to build a case.
Yes. Well, I even went more modest than that, to even grant what Ehrman is saying, that the Gospels are generally unreliable. Hence, the objection that he raises is because of the general unreliability of the Gospels, the resurrection cannot be established as a historical event. I'm even granting that. I'm going way beyond.
Right.
But in my view, even then, we can still establish the resurrection as a historical event, provided that we don't leave out God in the picture. I always emphasize this. Just because we have all these minimal facts, it's a done deal. No, it's not. You have to factor God in, and the religious context of Jesus' life. So let's not forget that. And so I'll leave it at that, and we can move on to the intrinsic improbability of miracles as we
Yeah, that'd be great.
You can go ahead.
This second objection that Ehrman raises is of particular interest because if miracles are just so improbable, then it makes it a lot harder to build a case for a miracle. And so maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what is Ehrman, how does he build his case for the improbability of miracles, and how does that all work from his perspective? And then we can get into your response and how you overcome that objection.
Yeah, so the second objection that Ehrman raises states that, number one, miracles by their very nature are least probable events. Number two, historians can only establish what is probable. And number three, that because of that 1 and 2, historians cannot establish miracles as probable events. Because how is it that historians who are only able to establish what is probable can possibly establish least probable events like a miracle of the resurrection of Jesus? So in all of those wordings that I just put out, there are three questions that come to mind, three major questions. One is, what are miracles? What do historians do as professional historians? And what then exactly is Ehrman's objection? Well, I've just articulated it, but at this point, I'm going to try to unpack it. So to begin with, when we discuss miracles, the discussion can go in many different directions.
Mhm.
And for the purpose of my thesis, I make a distinction between a definition of miracles and identification of miracles. Okay? Definition and identification. So how do we define miracles? Okay.
That's a good question.
And then how do we identify? Those are two different topics right there. People tend to confuse those two. So in my thesis, I aim to try to clarify, the difference.
Okay.
So,
well, I mean, a lot of people would even just say the birth of a baby is a miracle or being alive is a miracle, but I don't think that's what you're talking about here.
Right. Yeah. The sun rising looks beautiful. It's a miracle. Well,
is it just a coincidence? Does that qualify as a miracle? I mean, what is a miracle in your estimation?
Yeah. So, when we try to define miracles, we look at the Bible because the Bible is the one that teaches the resurrection of Jesus, which is a miracle. So I define miracles as occurrences that take place on earth that can only be performed by God. Okay, that only God can perform. Miracles are a temporary and rare divine intervention in the way nature regularly operates. Now, within the worldview of theism, God is the creator and sustainer of the natural world. God had set things in motion, such, things like, gravity. There is that law of nature, gravity, and it's a regularity. Okay, it's called the law of nature or the natural law. So, for example, gravity, Earth's gravity. When you drop a physical object, the ground is going to pull it because of the gravity, right? Now, if God makes gravity ineffectual, you drop an object, it just floats, it doesn't hit the ground. Well, that's a miracle. It's as simple as that. Let's not make it complicated.
Okay.
Okay, so you have the regularity of nature, natural law, such as gravity. That's just the way God put things together. Okay. Now this is within the worldview of theism. So if God makes gravity ineffectual and you drop a physical object, the object does not get pulled to the ground by the gravity. That is a miracle. Okay.
Okay.
So now the next question is, how do we identify a miracle? How do we know that it's really God that did it?
Right.
So looking at the resurrection, a man, Jesus of Nazareth, was put to death via a Roman crucifixion. And then a few days later, this dead man was raised by God physically back to life. We know that dead men stay dead. Yeah, they don't become alive again. A truly dead man, truly dead people, they don't become alive just like that. Okay.
Yeah.
We know this from the way nature regularly operates. But since God exists and he can and did raise Jesus back to life, such an event is a miracle. It is a temporary and extremely rare event that only God can perform by intervening within the law of nature. So going back to my other question, how do we identify that the resurrection of Jesus is a miracle? Well, number one, the resurrection of Jesus took place within a context of religious significance. The life of Jesus is replete with religious significance. He claimed to be God's human Messiah. He claimed to be God's agent in ushering God's people into God's kingdom. He had a ministry of reconciliation to God, healing miracles, nature miracles, and exorcisms. And he claims to be God's final revelation. And we can also make the argument that Jesus even predicted his own death and resurrection. So all of those put together, and then we look at the Old Testament, talking about the coming Messiah, Jesus' life and the Old Testament, that put them all together. That's how we identify that what happened to Jesus was a miracle. I'm going to pause right there and let you ask questions.
Okay. Well, to start with, your definition of a miracle is that it's something that God did that is rare and that is
Extremely rare.
temporary.
Temporary, extremely
Am I
rare.
getting that right?
Yes.
Okay. I'm trying to think of what else might qualify for that. For me, a lot of times I used to think of miracles as a suspension of natural law, but over time I've come to conclude it more as an intervention.
Right.
So that God is doing, in your analogy of dropping something and gravity pulling it, God is doing something to hold it up, whether that's forming an anti-gravity field around the object or somehow doing something to the molecules to reduce their density or whatever. I don't know. But he's
Yeah.
doing something that is not like turning gravity off, but like changing the fact. I mean, I can
Yes.
counteract gravity very easily. I just lift an object up with my hand and wow, look at that. I counteracted gravity. So
Right.
It's not necessarily all that strange of an idea
Yeah.
when a human or another agent does it, but when God does it, we define it as a miracle.
Yes. That's a good point. I don't even call a miracle a violation of the laws of nature, because what is there to violate? Like as though it's some kind of, immorality that some agent out there is committing. Uh, God, who is the creator of all things, he's the sustainer of all things, can in fact do whatever he wants in principle with what he created. So it's just an intervention. It's a making things uh irregular,
Yeah.
extremely rare, and it's temporary.
Yeah.
And there is a reason for that, and I can get into that later. I will get into that later when we get into the third objection. Could it be that the reason why God used the resurrection of Jesus, because it's a miracle, he's trying to get our attention?
Yeah.
Hey, this is me speaking, and listen to me, listen to my son.
Yeah.
So
Resurrection too, given the context, the Jewish Second Temple Jewish context, it's just loaded with so much significance, theological significance,
yes.
historical significance, um, and it is a rather weird occurrence because most other civilizations wouldn't even wish to have their body back, right? They're They're just imagining some other kind of afterlife, a
Yeah.
disembodied afterlife of some sort. Getting your body back is, I don't know if you ever heard of Celsus, the anti Christian who wrote the True Logos, countering
Hmm.
against the Christian idea. He was writing in the second century, and Origen wrote a book against Celsus in the
Yeah.
third century. And Celsus talks about the resurrection as being a hope fit for worms. Like why? Only worms would want flesh back again, because they like to eat it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just like the ridicule of it. And so I think because it is weird, from the perspective of most civilizations and most different religions, that almost brings like a more ring of authenticity to it,
Yes.
as being the way God chose to indicate this and vindicate this one as his anointed.
Yeah.
And yeah,
It's
go
a
ahead.
huge attention getter.
It's a huge attention getter for sure.
Yeah.
And it's also something that fits very nicely in with some of these prophecies that we see in the Hebrew Bible, like Daniel 12:2 or
Yeah.
Ezekiel 37, or some of the oracles in Isaiah 25 or 26, and other hints and foreshadowings of this being a pattern or a desire to live on a renewed world rather than to be, I don't know, transhumanized into some sort of other non-physical plane.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I really think there is, like when you really get into the mindset of it, there's a lot of logic to why this as the miracle that God chose for proving that Jesus is his anointed one, his agent, his super prophet, the Son of God. So where should we go from here as far as this whole business of improbability? I mean, you're just granting that, right? You're saying it's very rare. Well,
Yeah.
Ehrman's going to say, well, if it's very rare, then we shouldn't even talk about it.
Yeah. 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 So in my thesis, I aim to show that Ehrman is confusing rarity slash frequency with probability. Okay.
Okay.
Just because an event, he even grants that that the resurrection happened. He's not even arguing against that it actually took place. But I'm also trying to point out that Ehrman is confusing rarity slash frequency with probability. Just because an event like the resurrection is extremely rare, like one in how many it happened one time and how many billions and billions of human beings. Just because it's rare doesn't mean it's unlikely. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I would say, along the lines of that, that any historical event is unlikely, right?
It's well in terms of infrequent or rarity.
Yeah, I guess not like, so. Let's say it's 1,000 years from now. You're looking back on my life, and
Yeah.
I got up and kissed my wife goodbye, and I went to work. That's not that's not a rare event historically, but there are lots of rare events in history, right? So like
Right.
the classic event of Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. What was the probability of that event? What was the rareness factor?
It's extremely rare. It's so infrequent. So I think Bart Ehrman is confusing the two. So yeah, we can go back to this later. Let me go ahead and talk about what historians do. They try to establish what probably happened in the past. Professional historians do that, and they do not say, and yeah, they do not have a say anything on theological matters. They do not have a say on theological matters. I'm sorry. And so that's not their department. Their department is to look at evidence, and they try to establish what probably happened based on the available evidence. And it's not their job to assess theological claims like the idea that God raised Jesus from the dead. And so what then is Ehrman's objection? Well, since miracles are least probable events, historians try to establish what is probable, it follows necessarily that historians cannot establish miracles. So it seems that intuitively it makes sense, right?
Mhm.
I just want to throw that out to you and ask you, does that make sense though? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's the
and a
sort of
lot of
thing.
people buy into this too, and they're like, "Woof, that makes sense."
Yeah, it's the sort of thing that each premise sounds very convincing, but then the conclusion, I'm kind of, squinting my eyes, saying, "Well, that doesn't seem right." It seems like there's something missing here. So
Yeah,
you want to say, on the one hand, miracles are very improbable. Everyone will probably grant that,
yeah,
and historians can't describe anything other than what probably happened. Therefore, historians can't talk about miracles. Um, to me, that it feels like a very slick way to avoid any kind of messy or hard questions.
yeah,
It
yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
sound. It doesn't feel. I'm not trying to accuse Ehrman of being disingenuous or anything, but it just feels like he's just trying to avoid talking about it, and you know, it doesn't feel very compelling to me.
yeah. In my thesis, I even get into technicalities in refuting this objection of his. So here is an argument, a deductive argument that I put together. It's almost verbatim from what Ehrman's writings and works. Okay, so premise one says historians try to establish what probably happened in the past.
Mhm.
Premise two, miracles are least probable events. Conclusion, therefore, historians cannot establish miracles as probable. Now, the reason I believe this is a deductive argument is because of that conclusion right there. Historians cannot cannot establish miracles as probable. That is a categorical statement. Okay, that is not drawn from inductive research, and it is actually philosophical
Hmm.
truth claim.
Yeah.
Okay, and he did not arrive at this from induction. He arrived at this from a deductive argument. He may not realize this, and I'm not really sure if he even recognizes that what he's putting out here is a deductive argument or can be framed as a deductive argument. So in my thesis, I aim to disarm his argument here, his objection. So when we look at this as a deductive argument, we have to look at the truth and validity. Okay. So the truth has to do with the truth of each statement, the truth of premise one, the truth of premise two, and the truth of conclusion. Now, if premise one and two are true, then it follows necessarily that the conclusion is true as well. Okay. Now, there is also what's called validity. Validity has to do with the way the deductive argument is framed. Uh, Now, I'm using an Aristotelian logic where we have affirmative statements versus negative statements.
Yeah.
Okay, we're getting into a major term, a minor term, middle term, and from what I can see, this argument is invalid. Now, if it is invalid, even if every one of your statement is true, premise one, premise two, and the conclusion are all true, but if the way it's put together is messed up, if it violates any of the categorical syllogism rules, guess what? The whole argument is invalid.
There you go.
Okay. Now, let's unpack this step by step. So now, like I've said, if premise one, two, and then conclusion are all true, and the frame is properly put together, then the argument is sound. Okay, it goes through. It is a good argument. He is right with this conclusion, namely, historians cannot establish miracles as probable. So, in my thesis, I steel man Ehrman's argument in a number of angles. But even with all of those steel manning, his argument still comes out to be either invalid or unsound. Now, let's take a look at premise one. Historians try to establish what probably happened in the past. Let me ask you this, Sean. What do you think of that statement? They try to establish what probably happened in the past. Do you think that's a true statement? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I just want to.
It seems true to me.
Yeah, it is.
You want to discern historical documents. Say, for example, you're reading, I don't know, Pliny the Elder, and he's talking about Mount Vesuvius, and he's also talking about politics, and he's also talking about, I don't know, botany, and you're just like, you know what? I want to discern what probably I want to use this source to see what actually happened in the past. But I can't be sure. I can't be 100% sure. Right. Or if you look at Plutarch and his lives, or Suetonius, you have these different accounts of what happened, and so you're trying to figure out, well, what probably, I can't be 100% sure, but what probably happened. It seems like a very reasonable, minimalist approach to historiography.
Yeah. Now, in this particular statement, premise one, historians try to establish what probably happened in the past. Ehrman also has this implicit ingredient, if you will, that historians don't deal with theological claims, okay? Now, I want to capitalize on that one, okay? And let me explain. In my attempt to refute the intrinsic improbability of the miracles, I'm actually granting that the theological matters are put aside, okay? We're not even mixing any theology in this whole argument. We're putting theology on the side. We're merely looking at probabilities of miracles. Whether God is involved with it or not, it doesn't matter. We put God aside, okay? And so I am actually capitalizing on that one.
Okay.
And in my view, even if we put God aside, Ehrman's argument still does not go through because of the way he put this argument together, because of its invalidity and unsoundness. So, yeah. So, you and I both agree that premise one is true. And what about premise two? Miracles are least probable events. Now, notice that earlier I said that Ehrman is confusing rarity / frequency with probability, right? Now, when you hear Ehrman makes the statement, miracles are least probable events, he tends to mix rarity / frequency with probability, okay? And when you analyze it, he's actually committing a number of fallacies there. Now, for example, in his writings, he would say in one breath, miracles are infinitesimally improbable. What does that mean? Does that mean miracles are impossible? Because he keeps using the word infinitesimally, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a big question of how is he calculating his probability? What is his
Yes,
baseline? Right. So
right.
if if let's say we're just talking about intervention, just natural human intervention.
Yeah.
Let's say my child is climbing something in the backyard. Let's say
Mhm.
climbing a tree, or, well, I'll give you a real example.
Sure.
I have a trampoline in the backyard, and one of the greatest things our family has ever purchased. And
Mm.
I also have a shed in the backyard. And a couple of my sons thought to put these objects together.
Yeah.
And so one of them climbed on top of the shed roof and wanted to jump off the roof onto the trampoline. Now, um, there are, if my wife sees that, if their mother sees that,
Mm.
what is the probability she goes outside and intervenes and says, "Don't jump off the roof"? And what is the probability that I intervene?
Right.
And those two probabilities are different. They're very
Yes.
different. Even though we're both human beings and we both care about the children, the probability of her going outside is very, very high. If she sees it, she's going to go outside and she's going to say, "Don't you do this. You're going to get hurt." And I understand why she thinks that way, but I also have a different, level of comfort with risk, especially with the older boys. That
Then,
instead
yeah.
of intervening, what I would do is go out and say to them, "Boys, I want you to think carefully about the angle that you jump at, because you're going to come out of the trampoline at whatever
Mm.
angle you go into it."
You're gonna hurt
And,
yourself.
so I'm going to give them instruction and then watch them jump.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she's going to intervene. So how do we calculate those probabilities? Well, it's based on her experiences, based on my experiences. I've done some
Yeah.
dumb things like this, and it worked out okay. And maybe she hasn't. So she's more concerned than I am. But these probabilities are different depending on the history of that individual and the
Yes.
likelihood and all this. So calculating a probability is not just a simple thing. A probability for intervention, which is what a miracle is God intervening on a dead person to make them
Right.
alive again. And so a lot depends. Is this dead person someone that claimed to be
Hmm.
Messiah?
There you
So
go.
that's all part of is there a God? If there's not a God, then,
Yeah.
as you
Yeah.
already
Yeah.
said
Yeah.
before. So I want to hear more about this calculation of the probability. How do you approach that?
Yeah. In my thesis, I use a probability calculus called Bayes theorem. Bayes theorem is put together by Thomas Bayes, who was a Presbyterian and a statistician back in the 1700s.
Okay.
It's a calculus that he put together where he calculates the what's called posterior probability. You know, the outcome when you put the claim, a theory, um, the background. You know, you mentioned God being in the background, uh, the evidence, right? And then he also, you know, Bayes theorem also factors in the evidence, how evidence behaves if the resurrection didn't happen. Okay, how the evidence behaves if the resurrection, did I say didn't?
Yeah, you said didn't.
Did not, right?
Yeah.
So he also factors in if the if the resurrection did happen. So put them all together, the posterior probability comes out to be high. It all depends on the evidence. If you have enough evidence, and if those evidence are solid, what is the likelihood that the evidence are there if the resurrection didn't happen? It's really low.
Wow.
Now,
just pause for a
yeah,
second.
Sure.
What's the difference between these two terms you're using? The posterior probability and the prior probability. Can you
Yeah,
talk about that? Just explain that a little more.
Yeah, the prior probability is merely looking at the probability of a hypothesis, merely looking at the background. Okay, so for example, the hypothesis of the resurrection of Jesus. We look at the background of his life. Okay, Jesus existed. He lived a religious life. He claimed to be God's messenger, et cetera, et cetera. That's the prior probability. Now, the prior probability of the resurrection also has the background of God being there. So when you factor God in, guess what? The prior probability goes up already.
Right. Yeah.
And then you look into, that's just the prior probability before looking at the evidence. And so you look at the evidence, right? And how they behave if the resurrection happened. Well, guess what? Put them together, you have posterior probability. It keeps going up.
I see.
So the prior has the background only. The posterior has the background plus evidence.
Okay. So
that's the best way I could put it.
Yeah.
There are so many details to be discussed, and yeah, it kind of gets complicated a little bit too.
Yeah, well, I don't think many of us are accustomed to thinking through that statement. Miracles are, least probable events.
Right.
Most of us are going to say, yeah, I guess so, because like normally they don't happen.
Yes.
But we're kind of then unwittingly admitting that therefore the gospels are wrong, and proper history, as opposed to this religious history, can't admit the possibility of a miracle.
Yeah.
And what I hear you saying is that this prior probability is, all the information going up to the event, but not including the actual evidence for the event happening.
Right.
Posterior is adding that in. And, I really appreciate your other point about how if the event didn't happen, then you have to consider, like, well, what do I do with all this evidence?
Exactly. And it's not the minimal facts. Oh, man. If you have maximal facts that, Lydia and Timagru advance, man, it keeps going up. It keeps getting stronger and stronger. It's not just 4 facts. It's not just 6. It's lots and lots of evidence. Mm-hmm. If all those evidence are in place, man, what do you do with it? If Jesus didn't rise, then those evidence go down. The probability of that, right, of that factor goes down, which is, do you want to really accept that? Are we being reasonable if we allow that to happen? I think we're being unreasonable if we let that happen. Yeah. We can't let that happen because the evidence is so strong.
Yeah. And I think there's too a concern that if the historian allows for miracles to occur, I think it's just a modernist bias. There's just like an old hangover Enlightenment mindset that
now
just like denigrates miracles as being not legitimate to the enterprise of history, right? I mean, it seems like just an old presupposition hanging around that doesn't even belong.
Well, like I've tried to explain earlier, in my thesis, in this area of trying to refute Ehrman's objection, namely the intrinsic improbability of the miracles. I'm even saying, well, we can even put God aside. Even then, we can still argue that the resurrection can, in principle, be established.
Mhm.
Now, I make it very clear, I think, that in my thesis, I'm not saying that the evidence we have do in fact raise the probability. Okay, putting God aside, we're just looking at the evidence, right, for the resurrection. Do they in fact, in practice, give us a high posterior probability? Well, that's another discussion. Okay, I'm only saying in principle we can, if we have enough evidence. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Even without God in the picture, if we have lots and lots of evidence that's even acceptable by all the skeptics in the world, if we have enough, the question is, do we have enough? Well, probably not. That makes sense?
yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
So I want to let that sink in there, especially for our viewers.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that you're not assuming God's existence going in?
Right. I'm even just putting that aside.
Okay.
Yeah, the prior probability doesn't even have God in there. The prior probability is way down. It's not zero, because zero is impossible. It has a positive non-zero prior probability. It's very, very low, right? Because God is not in the picture, right? Even then, in principle, we can still raise the posterior probability later on if we have lots and lots of evidence.
Yeah.
That's just in principle. That's just mathematical principle. That's
Yeah.
all I'm trying to say here in my presentation, in my refutation of Bart Ehrman's second objection.
Yeah. I see. You also have this elaborate equation.
Yes.
Could you talk about that a little bit? Because I think a lot of people would be just sort of surprised to know that in the course of doing apologetics or history, that you have an equation that could be of any use. Um, would you be willing to talk about that a little bit and what that equation can um, help you get at as far as conclusions?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have. Let's see. I wish I have a PowerPoint here. Yeah, it kind of gets complicated because let's see here. If I go to, if anybody can get a hold of my thesis on page 52,
Mhm. Yeah, that's the one I'm looking at.
I wonder if I can share this. Um,
Oh, let me empower you.
yeah, if I may share this page here on page 52.
All right, try it now.
Okay, let's see here. Now do I go to share screen?
Yep.
I think I go there, yeah. Okay, share.
Very
Is
good.
it showing yet?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, this is the page 52 of my thesis, and I'm going to zoom it in, right?
Yep, looks good. So
So,
you've got P, R, B, and E.
right.
Maybe you
This is
could.
the posterior probability right here.
Okay.
Are you seeing the highlights there,
Yeah,
boss?
yeah.
Okay, good. Let me go ahead and try to expand it even more. So you have the probability of the resurrection, R, given our background information, plus the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus,
Okay.
okay, equals this calculus right here. So you have this term right here is similar to this one right here. They're exactly similar,
Okay.
okay?
So just for the audio listeners, the numerator and the denominator are the same, but there's an additional term in the denominator
Right.
beyond
You
that.
add another term,
Oh, the
which
probability of it
is,
not happening given the background information.
that's correct. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So the posterior probability writer equals this one and that one plus that one, right?
Uh-huh.
So this one is the probability of direction on background information only, multiplied by the probability of the evidence for the resurrection, given the background and the resurrection happening or
Okay.
occurring, okay?
Right.
Over the same thing, plus the probability of the non-occurrence of the resurrection, given the background, multiplied by the probability of the evidence for the resurrection, given the background, plus, and the non-occurrence of the resurrection. So it's very, very difficult to put numbers and actual mathematical
Yeah.
numbers.
Yeah, that's I'm dying to see what numbers you assign to these values.
Yeah, yeah,
These
that that
variables.
that could get really, confusing. But let's see here. This is the explicit form taken from the list of 8 forms of Bayes theorem put together by Tim McGrew, by the way.
Okay.
So here I explain, right, the posterior probability of the occurrence of R, it tells how probable the resurrection is given the value of the prior, the explanatory, the prior of the non-resurrection, and the explanatory of the resurrection, given that the resurrection didn't happen. Okay, I'm sorry about this. Let's see here. So here,
let's jump down to the numbers, because you do throw some numbers in there on the next page. Yeah, there we go.
okay, so
Explain that a little bit. You said
yeah,
the probability
let's
of the
see here.
resurrection based on the background information is 0.00001.
Yeah. So let's see here. Having set the stage here, I'm trying to remember what. Having set the stage, how then are historians able to establish at least probable events as probable? Well, if we grant that the prior probability is so low, okay, all I'm trying to say here is I'm already granting that it's very, very low, but it's not zero, because when you say zero, it's impossible.
Right.
For as long as you put a one in there, 0.0000001, that's positive right there. That's not zero. It still has a positive value, okay? No matter how low that is, guess what? If this right here, the probability of the evidence given background and the occurrence of the resurrection is equal to 0.9999, and this one right here is 0.00005, guess what? It would yield a 0.06666.
0.66.
Which is, yeah. So 0.66666. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah.
So that's a 66% chance or 67% chance that it happened.
That's correct. Yeah. So my point being here is, no matter how low the prior probability, if you have evidence that are strong enough, guess what? You can have 66% probability, posterior probability right here. I hope I'm not
do you think a
losing
historian would
anybody
be
here.
satisfied with that kind of a number, or what do they want?
Say that again.
Would a historian be satisfied with a 67% probability? What are they looking for?
Well, it depends on the historian. They usually don't put numbers in their in their levels of certainty or uncertainty. So in my thesis, I discussed a system put together by a fellow named C.B. McCullough. Let's see here. Let me, if I can just Behan. Okay. By the way, are you following this so far, or am I losing you?
I'm with you.
Okay. All right, C. Behan McCullough. Okay, so let's see here. But right here, a second principle to consider is that grades of historical certainty are expressed often in words and sometimes in numbers. This is because grades of certainty necessarily involves mathematics, right? Mathematics.
Yeah.
More probable than not involves mathematics and is expressed in both in words and roughly in numbers. Scientists regularly utilize numerical expressions in determining probabilities. Historians regularly express grades of certainty as estimates in terms of quality rather than quantity, ranging from highly improbable through highly probable. Okay. Now, this is written by C.B. McCullough, who is a philosophy of history. According to him, these grade estimates, although possessing an element of subjectivity and arbitrariness, are generally based upon some acquaintance with actual frequencies. The grades historians, use, like the grades given for students' essays, can often be related to range of numbers. I'm sorry, there you go. So McCullough suggests that for most people, the equivalence to the grades of certainty would roughly be what follows. So, these are, I guess, the way historians generally, assign numbers. So extremely
So if you were
probable
gonna
would be 100 to
quantify it,
95%, right?
yeah.
Very probable would be 95 to 80, going down. He's going the opposite. I don't know why he did this, but I'm just quoting him directly.
Yeah.
So let's see here. I hope did I answer that question or?
Yeah, no, you did. Can you turn screen sharing off for a minute?
Sure. Where do I go here? Okay, stop share.
Yeah,
Okay.
appreciate it. Yeah, just so we can see your face a little better, and we can have a little conversation. We are drawing to a close here. I don't want to take too much of your time.
Yeah.
Look, what I see you saying, the big takeaway for me on
Right.
this equation business and the whole question of probability
Yeah.
is that the historian cannot say that
Yes.
the resurrection's probability based on background information alone tells you whether or not the historian has to do business with it. You also have to factor in the probability of the evidence for the resurrection, not just the
Amen.
background.
Amen and amen.
That's what I'm getting from you. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. So
It's as simple as that.
update our syllogism, please.
Okay, good. Going back to let's see here. You know what? It might be better if, well, I was thinking about sharing it. So premise one, historians try to establish.
Just go ahead and tell it to us. You don't have to share it. Just go ahead and tell it to us.
Okay,
The old
so
premise was remind us what were the old premises and conclusion, and then give us an update based on this research that you've done.
sure. So again, premise one says historians try to establish what probably happened in the past. Premise two, miracles are least probable events. Premise three, conclusion says, therefore, historians cannot establish miracles as probable. Now, in my thesis, I showed that this is an invalid, it is an invalid argument because of a number of violations of the categorical syllogism rules. Now, I'm not going to get into all of them. Let me just cite one example. Notice that in premise one, it is a positive statement, right? Historians try to establish what probably happened. That's a positive statement. You see it?
Yeah.
And then premise two, miracles are least probable events. That's also a positive statement. Conclusion, therefore, historians, what? Cannot. Well, guess what? You cannot draw a negative conclusion from two positive premises.
So is that soundness or validity?
That's validity. It's
Okay.
invalid because the conclusion is uh
Wow.
is
So
a, is
even
a is a stronger premise.
if the
This is called
premises were
I'm sorry, this is
true,
called the fallacy of weaker premise.
okay. So even if the premises were true, the argument is an invalid argument, so it doesn't even matter.
Doesn't
It
even
just
matter.
doesn't
Yeah,
follow. It's a non sequitur.
that's
And
right.
you, if you were to correct it, you would say, how would you fix it?
Well, I try to salvage this argument, right? And here is what I did. In order to have a, because you have to put a negative statement there in or negativity in either premise one or premise two. Okay. So here is what I did. I changed premise one to say historians cannot establish least probable events as probable. Okay. That's a negative statement. Okay. Premise two remains the same. Miracles are least probable events. Therefore, historians cannot establish miracles as probable. Well, now we have a valid argument because that negative in the conclusion cannot establish
Mhm.
is
That's your updated
is
premise one.
warranted by premise one, the new premise, namely historians cannot establish least probable events as probable. So this is a valid argument right here.
But does it sound?
But is it sound? Amen. Question. No, it's not. Why? Because number one, that he there's a smuggling business happening here. Okay. The idea that historians cannot establish miracles is already smuggled in premise one.
Right.
It begs the question. So it's arguing in circle.
So you're saying it's guilty of circular reasoning.
Yes.
All right. So let me see if I can re-say this back to you. The standard Ehrman argument against miracles is that since historians can only do what's probable, and miracles by definition are improbable, therefore historians can't and shouldn't properly do any business with miracles. That the problem with that is that, first of all, that's an invalid argument. And then if you try to fix it to make it a valid argument, then it becomes an unsound argument because you have to use circular reasoning to fix the whole thing. So
very good.
Really what we have here is rhetoric, not logic. Right? We have something that is persuasive and sounds good and
it sounds
convinces
persuasive.
people, but it's
right.
logically fallacious. And as a result, it's like kicking a leg out of a stool. The whole stool is going to tip over because now that it doesn't have this logical leg to stand on, the historian has to come back to it and say, oh, I guess I do need to do business with the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Yeah. And that's really your goal here, is to say, hey, look, Mr. Historian or Mrs. Historian, you can't ignore these facts. Yeah. And they say, oh, well, yes, we can ignore them because they're improbable. And you're taking away that from them. So now you're holding their feet to the fire saying, no, you really do have to look at this evidence.
It seems to me that Ehrman is the only one, well, from what I've read, he's the only one that's making this argument.
Yes, but he's got so many disciples, right?
There
are so many
other historians and
maybe not professionals, but online debaters, Muslim apologists, atheist websites that are citing Ehrman left and right using these ways of thinking.
Yeah, and I want to say this: a number of biblical Unitarians have been pointing this out. Not to mention Dr. Dale Tuggy and Josiah from Syndicate, Integrity Syndicate. They've been putting out that even biblical Unitarians are affected by this sentiment of anti-intellectualism.
Mm,
Yeah, we're either too scared or we're too pure to be, getting involved with logic and reasoning. And it, some of that I think is just laziness. Maybe it's a combination of that and being spiritual. If you don't get into logic, you're somehow super spiritual. I think we need to get away from that. I think we need to squash this anti-intellectual tendency amongst us.
yeah.
We get it from other Christians.
It's pretty
Even
common
amongst
in,
Trinitarians, it's it's
yeah,
it's everywhere.
yeah.
And even oneness people. Yeah.
It's pretty common. I think there's a fear there. I think there's a
There's also a
fear.
fear. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a fear that if we don't fight against intellectualism, that we'll just intellectualize our faith, and maybe we'll lose people that'll say, "Oh, I'm not smart enough to understand this this equation that you just showed us." I come from a math background. It didn't look hard to me. You just
Really.
have like two numbers in the top, and then
I have a news
four.
for you though. I hate math.
Okay.
I'm bad
Okay.
with math.
But my point is, if somebody's coming from your perspective of hating math or disliking
Oh yeah,
logic,
automatically. Oh man, I can't deal with that. My
they're
mind has
feeling
already exploded.
alienated and excluded. Like, well,
Right.
if my faith requires an intellectualism that's of a level that's beyond me, then I feel like I'm not
Yeah.
valid in my own faith. And that's not what you're saying, though. What you're saying is, look, um, just because you don't understand it doesn't mean that those who do understand it, those who are capable of it, shouldn't be allowed to explore there as well. Is that correct? Or
Oh
how
yeah.
would you respond to somebody that's like, oh, well, I'm worried about Aaron because he's getting so nerdy about these subjects, and if he continues down this path, he's going to be, people will be turned off to Christianity, or they'll think he's just too prideful,
Yeah. Yeah.
to make it so academic.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, I would say that uh, it may not be your place to get into the nitty gritty of nerdiness, but in my case, it's my calling I just have this responsibility placed by God to provide an answer, a good answer to nerdy skeptics out there.
Yeah.
We have to have people in place. If that's not your place, I respect that. But please stop saying, it's of the devil, it's a human logic, no, it's not. God created us with the ability to reason, to use logic.
Yeah.
When we come to the Bible, logic is already in place. Our understanding of language is already in place. And then we look at the Bible. We already have this moral intuition inside of us.
Mm.
And then we look at the Bible. We don't just look, we don't read the Bible and then, oh yeah, logic is true, and morality is from God. No, we already have it inside of us. And so we have to recognize that. Part and parcel of an apologist is to ground your religious epistemology and then build it and then develop it over time.
Yeah.
And when you ground when I say religious epistemology, I mean, religious belief and knowledge. That's what I meant. That's all I'm saying.
Or
I'm not trying
even
to
your
use any
belief
fancy
that
words.
logic itself is valid.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you know that, right?
Well, I think you need a presupposition, don't you? And so this is an area where naturalism really fails, and I think we'll probably talk more about this next time. But on
Yeah.
naturalism, you can't use logic to prove logic is valid.
Right.
Because you have to start somewhere, like the law of non-contradiction.
That's
That's
right.
like ground zero. But like, how do you prove the law of non-contradiction without using the law of non-contradiction?
Yeah, you can't.
Yeah, so you
You
need
have to assume it. You have to
an epistemic
presuppose it.
presupposition. And if you have good
Yeah.
evidence for God's existence and that God is also rational, then
Right.
you can make a starting point on all this.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I appreciate what you're saying there, but we really do need to wrap it up for today.
Sure.
Maybe you could just offer some concluding remarks on this. I think this other topic of anti-intellectualism is really important. We should talk more about it. But we're running out of time for today.
Yeah. Again, Sean, thank you for having me. This is exciting, and I appreciate you allowing me to share my thoughts about my thesis. And I hope I didn't get anybody confused here. And if I did, you can always email me, or maybe we can talk about it, in our next meeting, or you know, and yeah, looking forward to our next meeting, Sean. And again, thank you so much.
Yeah. All right, Aaron. Well, thanks for being on the show today, and I think you definitely gave people some things to think about, and some people may be wanting to dig in and
Right.
do the hard work of sorting through your P's and B's and E's and R's to really understand that equation. And you're not the only one doing this either. I've seen William Lane Craig establishing some probability calculus in his apologetics work, and
Right.
there is a place for it.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your diligent effort and your time today as well.